The story of the Magi following the star is so familiar to us that it can seem at times like a Disney story. And it leads me to wonder, is there another way that we can read this story so that it speaks to us today? Can we recover some of its power? I mean, what does Herod the Great and the Jewish leaders and the Magi, what do they have to say to us today? Perhaps if we read this story by paying attention to how these three respond to the good news, we'll begin to hear how this passage from Scripture can speak to us in our lives on this feast of the Epiphany. Well, let's look at Herod the Great. He's sitting in his beautiful castle in Jerusalem when the Magi enter the city gates and begin asking about the newborn king of the Jews. Now, Herod was a paranoid, homicidal maniac appointed by the Romans to keep the Jews at bay. And the very mention of a newborn king was a threat to his position and power. This was not good news for him. He knew he wasn't of the line of David. And he also knew if the real Jewish king showed up, things would change dramatically. So Herod's response to the gospel is one of deception and murder. Not exactly a role model for Christian disciples. So let's look at the Jewish leadership, the Jewish priests in Jerusalem. Archaeologists have excavated these fantastic mansions that these Jewish leaders had right near the Temple of Jerusalem. And these priests knew where the Messiah was to be born. They knew he was to be born in Jerusalem. And they could quote the prophet Micah as proof of their knowledge. But here's the sad thing. Even though they knew that the Christ was to be born in Bethlehem, they never left Jerusalem to go see him. Instead, their response to the good news is to simply ignore it, pretend like they didn't hear anything about it. You see, Jerusalem was the center of all political and religious life in ancient Israel. And surely, Jerusalem would be the place where God would begin to enact God's renewal of Israel. And surely God would work through the priests in Jerusalem and not some insignificant baby 5 miles south in Bethlehem. They couldn't imagine God would act in any other place than Jerusalem and in any other way than through them. Well, how about the Magi? They come to the capital of Jerusalem expecting that the newborn king of the Jews would be born in the current home of the king, that is, King Herod. Where else would the newborn king of the Jews be born? But here's what makes the Magi great. You see, they didn't let their expectations determine where God could work. They didn't box God into a predetermined place and time. They didn't box God into their own expectations. Instead, they searched, they listened, they heard Scripture, they let it guide them. And when they didn't find the newborn king of the Jews in Jerusalem, they didn't simply get on their camels and go home. No. They kept looking, and they were willing to even search in a backwater village like Bethlehem. And I think this is the message the Magi have for us today on the Feast of the Epiphany. Here it is. Expect to find God anywhere, and you will find God everywhere. Expect to find God everywhere, and you will find God anywhere. Believe that God is present and at work in all situations, and you will find God there. This was the attitude Magi had. Now what about us? Do you remember when you were in grammar school? Maybe that was too long ago. How about high school? Do you remember high school or college? During those years, most of us were busy making friends and going to school. Did it ever dawn on you at that time to look for God? Did it ever cross your mind that God could be at work in your family and friends and teachers, in your good experiences and bad experiences? I think for most people it never dawns on them to look for God as the Magi did. And so I think the Magi challenge us to discover God at work in every situation you encounter, especially in the ordinary and insignificant ones. If God can be found in a child in Bethlehem, God can be found anywhere. So expect to find God everywhere and anywhere, and you will find God anywhere and everywhere. With this approach, God can even be found in death. As some of you know, last August my dad fell off his ladder and died in a hospital in New Jersey. When the doctors came into the waiting room and told us his heart had stopped on the operating table, each of us said immediately and instantaneously, "Let him go, let him go." And I know for certain that it was the Spirit of God that inspired us to say that. And at the wake, it was the Spirit of God that moved over 600 people to come and say goodbye to him. Now, the Spirit of God can be found in death. The Spirit of God can be found anywhere and everywhere. So this Epiphany, let's take on the attitude of the Magi. Let's not allow our expectations and assumptions to box God in. Rather, let's expect to find God anywhere and everywhere. Happy Epiphany, everyone.